I'm in my kitchen today, and this is where I'm going to do my experiment. And I chose the kitchen because I realized that I do a lot of science in my kitchen, because I do a lot of cooking in my kitchen. And cooking is science because you follow a certain pattern when you cook. You use certain solutions when you cook. You make mixtures. You take two different things and make something new, just like you do in science, right? You heat things up to change them, just like in science, right? Cooking is science. It's so cool, right? So I figured I'd start out in the kitchen and do this. So we're doing an experiment because we're talking about, which habitat are we talking about? Where animals live underwater. We're talking about the ocean, right? And we know that ocean water is different from other types of water. The ocean water is different how? What is different about it? What happens when you swim or you go near the ocean and it gets near your mouth and you taste it? Don't drink it, but what does it taste like? It's salty, right? There's salt in ocean water. So that means that ocean water is made up differently than other bodies of water. So when I sit at the beach, I look out into the ocean and I wonder, wow, there's some really big whales out there. A whale is the biggest animal on earth. It's huge. And I would think if it's huge, it's really heavy. But I wonder, why is a big, heavy whale able to float in the ocean? Shouldn't it just drop down to the bottom and stay there? What would happen if a whale dropped down to the bottom and stayed there? From what we know about whales, we know that the whale has to come up to the surface and blow and suck in air in its blowhole and throw out the water out of its blowhole. If it doesn't do that, it can't breathe because it's not a fish. It doesn't breathe through gills, right? So we know that a whale has to come to the surface. How does a whale stay on the surface? Why doesn't it float to the bottom? Let's get to the bottom of this through science. Let's do an experiment. So we're going to do an experiment. We're going to talk about salt water. I'm going to give you a vocabulary word. It's a big word. It's like a college word, right? Density. We describe salt water as dense, meaning that it's packed up with salt in it. It's got salt in it and makes it heavier. And because it's heavier, it can hold a whale up, okay? But we want to prove that. How can we prove that? So we're going to take two kinds of water. We're going to take fresh water and we're going to make salt water, okay? So you're going to start with 2 glasses and I filled them 2/3 full. Are they full to the top? No. Are they half? No. They're 2/3. Most of it's full, but I left a little bit on top, okay? And I used warm water because what I want to do is I want to take my liquid water and mix it with my solid salt and make a solution. I want the salt to dissolve into the water because that's what happens. That's science, right? Two things that are different, a liquid and a solid, you put them together and you make something new. So the warmer water will help the salt dissolve. That means it's going to dissipate into the water. It's going to become part of the water, right? 2 glasses, 2/3 full. I have salt. Look, see what this, you know what salt is. You use salt to make your food taste a little bit better, right? A little salty, not too much though. It's not healthy too much. Okay, so we're going to make our own salt water. We're going to make a fresh water and a salt water glass. And then we're going to take an object. I'm going to start with an egg. I have 2 eggs. If you don't have eggs, you can use any objects you want. And I want you to take this experiment to another level and keep experimenting with different things. You remember when we learned sink and float all the way in the beginning of the school year? We had a big tub of water and we were seeing what sinks and what floats, okay? We're going to take that further now and see what sinks and what floats in salt water. Now, my question is, how does the salt water affect the ability to float? Okay, how does the density of the salt water, does it make it easier for something to float or harder for something to float? So in the salt water, is my egg going to sink or float? In the fresh water, is my egg going to sink or float? That's what we want to know. Let's make an educated guess. Let's make a hypothesis. What do you think? When I put the object into the fresh water, will it sink or will it float? An egg's pretty heavy. There's not a lot of air in an egg, right? We knew that objects that have a little air in them float because the air helps them float. This is a pretty heavy object. What about the salt water? Do you think it's going to sink in the fresh water or float in the fresh water? I think it might sink in the fresh water. What about in the salt water? We know that salt makes the water denser. It makes it heavier and able to hold up a little better. Do you think the egg is going to sink in the salt water or float in the salt water? Why don't we find out? Okay, so we have fresh water. Leave it alone. Leave it fresh, okay? Then we're going to make salt water. How do we make salt water? We take liquid water and add solid salt to it. And it says we need to do about 3 tablespoons of salt. So I'm going to use yeah, it's just a spoon, but it's a special spoon. It's a measuring spoon, okay? See, we have to measure out things in science and also in cooking. So see, we need these. Sometimes it says add 2 tablespoons. You have to be exact, okay? So let's add 3. So I'm gonna scoop up, that's 1. Count with me, ready? 1, pouring it into the water, 2, and 3. Okay, what do you think is going to happen? I didn't show you yet, that's why it's down here. What do you think is gonna happen to the water when I put the salt in? Do you think it's gonna look different? Well, here's the fresh water, and here's the salt water. What's different about it? Already you can see the fresh water is clear, the salt water is cloudy. Why is the salt water cloudy? What do you think? You hear that sound? I'm mixing the salt into the water. Look, I'm mixing it up. What I want to happen is I want all that salt to dissolve into the water because I want it to make the water heavy. We already noticed the salt changed the appearance of the fresh water, right? There's a difference in the color because that means that the salt is dissolving into the water, okay? So let's see, what should we do next? Let's test it. Let's take the fresh water, drop an egg in the fresh water. You ready? Let's count. 1, 2, 3, drop it. Oh, what happened to the egg? Is the egg sinking or floating? That egg sank right to the bottom. There is no air in that egg. It's filled up with yolk and yummy things to eat. So now that you've seen what happened to the egg in the fresh water, let's mix up the salt water a bit more. Make sure it's all cloudy. That means that it is a solution now. What's going to happen to the egg when I put it in the salt water? What's your guess? Sink or float? Let's see. Well, it's kind of hard to see. But if you look closely, because the water's so murky, there it is. Do you see it? It looks like a whale in the water. It's floating. It's floating! Look at the difference. That egg's all the way at the bottom. This egg, you can see, is floating on the top. Look at that. I wish I could show you from the top, but I can't. Look. Look. Do you see it? The egg is floating. It's like magic. No, it's not. It's science. We figured it out. So, can we say that salt water is more dense than fresh water? Yes, it is thicker and heavier because it has salt in it, right? Which means that it will make objects float. And now we understand why humongous, huge, enormous animals like whales can float in the water. So cool. So I want you to try this at home, and I want you to go around and find other objects. Maybe your little Lego people or little dolls or anything that you can get wet. Don't put anything in them that's not supposed to be wet, and please ask your grown-up to help you with it, okay? Do this fun experiment and see if the salt water holds up all of your objects. And I'm going to see you at Zoom where we're going to do a sea ocean creature guessing game. Okay, I'll see you later. Have fun with science.